tell here.
I'll go back to China.
If anyone should be building a wall, it's Canada, frankly. Yeah, the Canadians are down with that. Yeah, like Trudeau could build anything. But Jordan, he started, there was this whole issue about the pronouns, right? That Jordan basically said, I am a free man of my own free will and free mind, and the government cannot tell me what pronouns to use. That doesn't mean I dislike. Woo! You guys are very good on the applause. Yeah, you fully realize that this is a live show. I like that. No tape delay here. Applaud, go crazy, you can scream, whatever you want to do. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. My parents are here. This is. What'd I tell you, Ma? I'm getting on YouTube. It's gonna work out. Okay. But really, all Jordan wanted to do is the exact same thing that any of us want to do, which is exercise our mind. Be able to think the way we think, be able to speak the way we speak, and to understand what the issues of the day are. And since then, in this last year, I mean, I can go down the list of the people that, Eric Weinstein, who I'm sure many of you guys know, coined this phrase, the intellectual dark web. And there is something happening, and you guys are part of it. That's the beauty of it. You guys are part of it. But this guy right here, he really, I think, is the center of it. I mean, this guy's got, I think it's the #1 book in the world. I mean, Bible, Schmible. He looks good. I don't want to say something else. A lot of people ask me when I do college gigs or I'm out on the street or whatever, people ask me about Jordan. And they always ask me, well, is he the same? Off camera, is he the same? And I got to tell you guys, I know Jordan pretty well now. And it's been an honor and a pleasure, getting to know him. And he truly is the same. He talks as fast when he's off camera. He moves his hands possibly even more when we're together. And he cares about this stuff, and he is living this stuff. And you know what? Just in the last couple of weeks, how many of you guys saw all these ridiculous hit pieces about Jordan? Just in these last couple of weeks. You can boo that. You don't have to applaud boo by some bad people. Just terrible, right? Like just these endlessly hysterical, dishonest. I mean, the phrase that I've been using is that these people are activists, not journalists. And I was really trying to think, it's like, well, for years, these last 2 years, this guy has caught fire. And it's like, where were you guys? Where were you when we were all having these conversations? And then suddenly, they get it, right? And then they don't know what to do with it. And the reason they don't know what to do with it, is because he's talking about personal responsibility. What are these 12 rules that Jordan's gonna talk about tonight, right? Sit up straight, get your shit together, And that's a beautiful thing, but for the people that want to control you, that's the thing that they hate the most, because they don't want you to get your shit together. And this guy, being around him has forced me, in some ways, to get my shit together. So with that in mind, are you ready? Yeah! Come on, Chloe, I think you can get them to do a little better than that. Chloe, get moving. A little more than that, give me a little more, people. All right, this is absolutely incredible, guys. Really, there is an idea revolution happening in this country. You guys are part of it, but this guy right now is the center of it, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Peterson, everybody.
So I never got my wristband, so I could go out with it and just do that. Thanks.
Well, thank you. God, you guys.
You New Yorkers, you're a real tough crowd. Well, thank you. This is just completely ridiculous. It's like really is. Yeah. I came here about an hour and a half ago, and there were people like lined up around the block. I thought, well, what the hell are you doing? You've got seats, you know. Yeah. Well, look. Well, I'm really looking forward to talking to you guys tonight. Really, I'm hoping we'll get right to the bottom of things, man. That's the plan. So I'm going to just launch right into it. I'm going to talk to you about my book tonight. I'm going to try to go through all 12 rules, and yeah, and try not to get too digressive while I'm doing it. Each time I do this, I try to hit it from a different angle and to expand on the story and to make it clearer and all of that. So I'm going to try to do that again tonight. And start with rule 1. I heard somebody has lobster t-shirt, lobster claws, yeah. That's just one of many ridiculous things that have been happening, But the first chapter, which is stand up straight with your shoulders back, there's a variety of themes that I was trying to weave together, and I think that the 3 themes are something like hierarchy, inequality, and vulnerability. It's something like that. And I'll start with hierarchy because it's really, really an important issue. It's tied integrally into the issue of inequality, but I'll start with hierarchy. So, one of the things that Karl Marx suggested 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and not really all that originally because other people had made the same kind of comments, was that wealth tends to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And he regarded that as evidence of a certain type of profound unfairness. And, you have to give the devil his due. You really do. You can't make the arguments of those who stand in opposition to you weak. It's really foolish. You have to make them strong. Because then if you counter them, you've countered them in the best possible manner. And the thing about Marx's observation is that it was correct. Wealth does tend to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Now, having said that, there's some complexities about that absolutely 100% have to be addressed. The first is that it's not always in the hands of the same people. So if you look at how money distributes itself, imagine you're playing Monopoly. You guys have all played Monopoly. Every Monopoly game ends the same way, right? Everybody who's playing except one person starves to death, and the one person gets everything, right? But if you play 10 Monopoly games, that you find it's very seldom it's the same person who ends up on top across the entire set of 10 games. And Monopoly actually has more in common with real life than you might think, because Monopoly is essentially a game of chance. There's some skill in it. But if you run an economic game like Monopoly out to its logical conclusion, what happens is that one person ends up with everything and everyone else ends up with nothing. And that's actually a consequence of the randomness itself. And that's been modeled, by the way, by people who call themselves econophysicists. Like, who knows that there's econophysicists, right? Who would know that those sorts of people exist? But they've used mathematical equations, the mathematical equations governing randomness, to describe how money distributes itself in an economy. And it does just like Monopoly. Now, the real world's more complicated than Monopoly, and it's not only a random game. But there's a fundamental point here, and the point is that in complex systems, inequality tends to emerge. Now, the problem with the damn Marxists is that they lay that at the feet of Western civilization and capitalism. And that's a problem for 2 reasons. The first reason it's a problem is because it's simply not true. And that's actually a problem. The problem of inequality is way more serious than whatever problems capitalism and Western civilization have. Our societies aren't perfect, but compared to most imperfect societies, they're pretty damn good. But the thing that... But the thing that they're being blamed for is not their fault. You cannot lay inequality at the feet of capitalism. And that's why partly I wrote about lobsters. Because whatever else you might say about lobsters, they're not capitalists, right? They don't partake in a free market economy, and their societies aren't socio-cultural constructs. None of that is even vaguely true. It's seriously not true, but they still have inequality, and they still have hierarchies. And so what that means, and it's a point I make repeatedly in the chapter, is that hierarchical inequality is at least 1/3 of a billion years old. And so one of the problems with misdiagnosing its cause is that you lay it at the feet of a system that isn't producing it, or isn't producing it any more than any other system would. But the second is that you actually fail to take it as seriously as you need to take it if you're going to address it. So because right or left, one thing we should all be able to agree on, as far as I'm concerned, is that having people stack up in poverty at the bottom of your hierarchy is not good. Like, who likes that, right? Who, you see people marching, I'm against poverty. It's like, yeah, really? Who's for poverty? Like, no one. It's not like when well-off people walk down the streets of New York, say, and they see someone homeless, shivering away, suffering off to the side, they're thinking, hey man, strike one up for the capitalist system. Well, that isn't how people think. They're hurt by it, and they don't know what to do about it. They'll avoid it. Maybe they won't even look. They don't know what to do, but they're not bloody well celebrating it. And perhaps they don't offer money, and there's a variety of complex reasons for that, but that's at least in part because it's not obvious that in a situation like that, money directly helps. Or at least it's not a foregone conclusion that that's the proper solution. So no one likes poverty, and the evidence on inequality is pretty strong from the social science perspective. It's pretty clear that it doesn't matter what size and unit of social analysis you use, whether it's city, neighborhood, city, state, or country, the more inequality there is, the more the society starts to destabilize, and the more violent the men get. And that's also not good. And the reason the men get violent is because men are more violent than women, and so they get violent first. But the ones at the bottom, the ones who stack up at the bottom and don't see any way of potentially climbing to the top, think, hey, I don't have anything to lose. I might as well throw the whole thing up in the air and play a new Monopoly game. Maybe I'll come out on top this time. And that's not good, right? It's not good to have your society destabilized. So we know that there are some parameters within which our societies have to operate in order to maintain their stability. Everybody can agree on that. But enough with the misdiagnosis. That's my sense. It's like, okay, we can have a discussion about inequality, and we can agree that it can become a problem. But we're not going to blame it on capitalism, and we're not going to blame it on the free market, and we're not going to blame it on the patriarchy or Western civilization, because that's just wrong. So that's the first thing, and that's really an important thing. Now, the second thing is, well, how do you best? How do you? So we'll say that a hierarchy is a permanent element of social organization, right? It runs through the kingdom of life. Any complex life forms organize themselves into a hierarchy, and the winners tend to take more than the losers. That's how it is. Now, I never once claimed, although I've been accused of claiming that, well, because that's how it is, that's how it should be. It's like, there's a big gap between the way things are and the way they should be. Anyone knows that if they're the least bit philosophically astute. You can't say, well, there's beggars on the street and that's how it should be. It's like, that's completely foolish. We want to ameliorate the worst parts of the painful elements of reality insofar as we're able to do that. But that doesn't mean we know how to do it. There's a book that was just published by a guy named Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveler. I believe that's the name of it. It was just came out, and it's an analysis of inequality. It's quite good. It's kind of a technical book, but I'd recommend it. One of the things Scheidel did, he was curious about, well, is there anything that can be done about inequality? And so here's a question, an empirical question, a scientific question. Imagine that you stacked up left-wing governments, and you stacked up right-wing governments, and you measured the levels of inequality among the left-wing governments, and you measured levels of inequality among the right-wing governments. You'd hope, probably, that there would be less inequality in the left-wing societies, because after all, what they're trying to do desperately is to decrease inequality among all sorts of other things. But, you know, as I said, you give the devil his due. They're trying to reduce inequality. Well, Scheidel found there was no relationship whatsoever between the political stance of the government and levels of inequality. And that is not a finding to be, what would you say, to be thankful about, to gloat about, to be happy about. It's actually really quite catastrophic, because what it means is that we don't know how to manipulate socio-political systems to eliminate or even alleviate inequality. We simply do not know how to do it. And that's another indication of just exactly how deep the problem is. Now, I'm going to talk about some potential solutions as we progress, but, you know, we want to grapple with these things like intelligent human beings instead of like ideological robots. You know, and we can say, well, look, obviously the fact that some people that some people stack up at zero, and zero is a really hard place to get out of, that's not in anyone's best interest self-evidently. It's like, okay, well, what do we do about it? The answer is we don't know. Now, I think about and a lot of the things that we try to do about it make it worse. So the other thing Scheidel pointed out, and this is one of the horrifying elements of his book, is there are things we can do to reduce inequality. Mass plagues reduce inequality. Right. War reduces inequality. Why? Because everyone ends up at zero. And that reduces inequality. And when everyone's dead, they're all equal. And so those aren't solutions, I think, that we should necessarily be pursuing. But as far as Scheidel could tell, there aren't any self-evidently viable alternatives. And so then we have another problem too, which is, see, one of the things about capitalism and about the West, I would say in general, is that while we produce inequality, because we are producing inequality, we also produce wealth. And that's pretty new, right? In 1895, the average Western person lived on less than $1 a day, by today's standards, in today's money. So that's absolute poverty. So the typical person in 1895 was absolutely poor. Poorer than the typical person who lives on the planet now. And so this ability to produce wealth and to distribute it, which is something we're actually extraordinarily good at, is really quite new, and it's really quite fragile. But we're going great guns at it, you know. So I worked for a UN committee for about 3 years on, it was a committee for the Secretary General. It was the production of a report on sustainable economic development, something like that. And it started out, it was really Cold War narrative. It was nasty left versus right narrative, which I didn't like at all. Very pessimistic, very anti-human. You know, we're destroying the planet and we're horrible people and all that sort of absolute pathological rubbish. And so, oh Jesus, really, you know, enough of that. Seriously, enough of that. And so we tried to update the narrative from like 1984, which is where it was basically stuck, you know, and pointed out that a lot of things are really going well. You know, if we had any sense, collectively, we'd be celebrating. I follow this group on Twitter called humanprogress.org, which I like quite a lot, and they tweet out real positive things, you know, not feel-good stories, but like data-driven, optimistic news. And they had a mock-up of the New York Times front page recently that they tweeted, and it said, 186,000 people lifted out of absolute poverty today. And then the cut-line was, we could run that every day for the last 20 years. It's like, you think about that, you know? So the number of people in absolute poverty in the world fell by 50% between the year 2000 and the year 2012, which was 3 years faster than the most optimistic projections had suggested. It's like, yes, man, that's so good. You know, and the same thing is happening on all sorts of fronts. So, you know, the fastest growing economies in the world right now are in sub-Saharan Africa. It's like, and that's partly because the Africans have got a hold of cheap computational technology, right? Which is a massive deal. You hold in your hand a computational device that puts the computational devices that were used to launch the Apollo space program absolutely to shame, right? And everyone has one, and those who don't will have one soon. And, you know, that's one of the things that starts to make you rich. And about 300,000 people, hundreds of thousands of people a week are being hooked up to the power grid. You know, and we're kicking the hell out of child mortality and also all-cause mortality and extending life radically. And people are literate way more literate than they were 50 years ago across the world. It's like a lot of really amazing things are happening. Partly what's happened, I think, and this has made things more difficult in the United States in particular, is that a lot of the advances made by the working class in places, say, like India and China, have been purchased at the expense of an increasing standard of living for American working people. And so they're the ones who've really paid for this. And that's sad, and it's hard. But it's not so bad that the Chinese aren't starving, you know. It's not so bad that the Indians aren't starving. There's lots of them, and if they're in the economy and producing and moving themselves up to middle class, it's like that's a pretty damn good deal. And one of the things that really shocked me, well, particularly when I was helping write this report, was like, what the hell? Why don't we know this? Why aren't we like having a little party or even a big party about it instead of like biting off our own legs, which we seem to be doing in the West right now with all this idiotic political polarization? Like, things are not so bad. I mean, there's still a bloody catastrophe, right? Because life is a catastrophe. But comparatively speaking, it's like, well, and what's doing that? Well, I can tell you, it's not communism that's doing that. That's for bloody sure. What's happening is the free market, essentially. The free market is making people rich. It's increasing inequality at the same time, but at least while it's increasing inequality, it's stopping people from starving to death. I mean, that's something. So that's chapter 1. Well, there's a bit of an injunction in chapter 1 too. In rule 1 there, it's like, you know, so you have to battle with a number of things in your life, and you have to battle with the tragedy that's your life, you know, and you have to battle with the fact that you're not everything you could be and probably never will be. And, you know, you have to battle with the fact that you've got an evil heart just like the person next to you. It's like there's all sorts of things that you have to contend with in life that are very, very difficult. The fact of hierarchy and the fact of inequality and all of that as well. That's part of your intrinsic vulnerability, let's say. It's the price you pay for being, as far as I can tell. And we'll talk about that later. The question is, well, how do you deal with that unfairness, let's say, that intrinsic unfairness? Well, people are quite creative. I mean, some of the things we do to combat that's essential inequality is we generate a lot of different games. You know, like animals basically play one game, and you're either good at it or you're not. But human beings, we play hundreds of games, and if you're not good at one, you can maybe find another one that you're at least not so bad at, or at least improving at, or maybe you can invent your own game. And so that's a pretty creative thing to do, and we're pretty damn good at that. And so that's one solution. But another solution too is to, the question is, if the environment arrays itself into a hierarchy, how is it that you're best situated to play within that hierarchy? You know, and one answer might be to make yourself powerful, you know, in the physical sense or in the menacing and threatening sense, because especially the people who criticize hierarchy always presume that what makes you dominant in a hierarchy is something like raw power, which, by the way, is just not true. It's true to a limited sense among some animals. It's really not true among human beings. It's not even true among complex primates. Because what's been found among chimpanzees, for example, is that the brutal tyrant chimps tend to be ripped to shreds by the chimpanzees that they're tyrannizing as soon as they have a weak moment. And you don't have to have much of an imagination to see how that plays out on the human stage. And so it actually turns out that if you want to climb a hierarchy, let's say, that the hierarchy isn't a power hierarchy, not in a functioning society. It's more like a competence hierarchy, or more like a voluntary game. And the way that you climb it, actually, believe it or not, is by being a good person. And you might think, well, that's a little naive. It's like, yeah, no, it's not really that naive. First of all, it's not that easy to be a good person. And the second is, it's somewhat self-evident. You know, like, you know people that you trust and you don't trust. And like, once you don't trust someone, you really don't trust them. And it's really hard for them to recover from that. And if you don't trust them, you're not going to play with them. Not if you have any sense. And we're really good at relationship tracking, and we're especially good at tracking behavior that's ethically suspect, and we remember it. Like, one mistake will blow your reputation. You know, it's harsh, but it just shows you how important trust is. And if you act in a trustworthy manner, and I'm not saying this is enough to make your life, you know, all sparkles and rainbows. It's like, forget that. That ain't happening no matter what you do. But if you're someone that can be trusted, then the probability that you'll at least move towards some degree of success in your domain is radically increased. And so that's a good deal. And then the other thing too is that makes you a contender in a hierarchical game is a kind of courage. And it's a funny courage because it's paradoxical courage. This is one of the things I really like about the narrative structure of Christianity, I would say, because I think Christianity has done a very good job of detailing out this idea, is that if you, the competence that you need to manifest in life, the courage that you need to manifest in life, and it goes along with being someone that can be trusted, is to be someone who will stand up and expose themselves so... well, let's try a different term. Who will accept their vulnerability, right, and take that on as part and parcel of their responsibility. And part of that for human beings is to stand up. You know, because the most vulnerable part of us is face forward. We're unlike other creatures, right? Because other animals, they go around on all four. Their back is armored, and that's what they present to the world, essentially. But not us. We stand up and make the most vulnerable parts of us front and forward. And there's a kind of courage in that. Like there's a willing to take on the catastrophe of existence forthrightly. And that's what rule one is. It's not a finger-wagging injunction to stand up straight, you know, because there's something wrong with you if you don't, although there is. It's an encouragement to say, look, the way that you find out how strong you can be is to accept how vulnerable that you are. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, because we are self-aware creatures. We know perfectly well how badly we can be hurt. Well, we also know that we will be hurt. It's not just that we could be hurt. It's way worse than that. It's that we most certainly will be hurt in terrible ways. And to be able to stand up and take that, you know, and to take that like someone who's courageous, it's like, well, that'll float your boat, man. That'll make people respect you. That'll increase the probability that they'll trust you. And it'll allow you to sleep with a good conscience at night. And that's something. And maybe that's about as good as it gets. And so that's rule one.